On December 13, 1948, a 22-year-old American citizen was walking down Gorky Street in Moscow. He was heading to lunch. He had no idea that he would disappear into one of the most brutal systems of torture and imprisonment ever created by mankind. He would not see daylight for years. He would not hear a single kind word for months. He would not know if his family was alive or dead. His name was Alexander Dolgun, and this is the story of how he survived. But before understanding how he survived, it is necessary to understand what he survived. In 1948, the Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, was one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The secret police, the MGB, operated with complete impunity. They answered to no one. They followed no rules. They had the power to arrest, torture, and execute without trial, without evidence, and without anyone ever knowing what had happened to the victim. By 1948, Stalin had imprisoned somewhere between 15 and 17 million people in the Gulag system. 17 million human beings in labor camps, in prisons, in interrogation cells. Most of them had committed no real crime. Most of them would never be tried. Most of them would never be released, and most of them would never see their families again. Alexander Dolgun should have been one of them. He should have been forgotten. He should have died in that system like so many others did. But he did not. He survived through something extraordinary. Not through physical strength, not through luck, but through the power of his mind, through ingenuity, through an absolute refusal to let his spirit be broken by a tyrannical regime. To understand how an American ended up in a Soviet prison, it is necessary to go back to the beginning. His story starts in the Bronx, New York, in 1926. His father was an auto mechanic. His mother was a Polish-Russian Jewish woman. They were working people, ordinary Americans. But in the early 1930s, when the Great Depression crushed the American economy, they were desperate for stability and opportunity. In 1934, seduced by Soviet propaganda promising jobs, security, and a bright socialist future, Alexander's parents made a decision that would change everything. The Soviet Union was advertising for skilled workers. They promised good wages, housing, and a better life. For a struggling immigrant family in Depression-era America, it sounded like salvation. So when Alexander was just 8 years old, the family left New York and moved to the Soviet Union. It was a catastrophic mistake. As they were leaving the United States, the Soviet Union was sinking deeper into one of the worst periods of state terror in human history. Stalin's Great Terror was beginning. The secret police were arresting people by the hundreds of thousands. Show trials, executions, mass deportations. Millions were disappearing into prisons and camps. The Dolgun family, American citizens, found themselves trapped inside this tightening net. Alexander spent his childhood and teenage years watching the machinery of terror grind on. He grew up during Stalin's Great Terror from 1936 to 1938, when Soviet security forces executed hundreds of thousands of people. He grew up during World War II, when the Soviet Union suffered some of the highest casualties of any nation. Somehow, his family survived the war and the purges. Somehow, they remained alive in a country where a wrong word could mean death. By 1948, Alexander was fluent in both English and Russian. Bicultural, he was trapped behind the Iron Curtain, but he had skills. At 17, he got a job as a messenger at the American Embassy in Moscow. Over time, he was promoted to work in the consular section, dealing with archives and documents. For 5 years, from 1943 to 1948, he worked for the U.S. State Department. He had access to diplomatic papers, he had a valid American passport, he had a steady job, and by all accounts, he was competent, loyal, and discreet. He had no political agenda. He was not a spy. He was an archivist.
But in the mind of the Soviet security apparatus, contact with the American embassy was suspicious by definition. An American citizen who worked with classified paperwork and who had ties to the West could be turned into whatever the MGB needed him to be: a conspirator, a saboteur, a spy. On December 13, 1948, during his lunch break, the trap closed. He was walking along Gorky Street, one of Moscow's main thoroughfares, when a man approached him, talking loudly. When he showed his identity documents, the man took them and didn't return them. The stranger told him, "Here comes a friend with a car." A car rolled up with both rear doors already open. Alexander tried to run. Two more men grabbed him and threw him into the vehicle. In an instant, his life as he knew it was over. The car sped through Moscow. No explanations, no charges, no warrant. They did not tell him what he was accused of. They did not tell him where they were taking him. They simply drove until the car pulled up in front of a large yellow building in central Moscow, the headquarters of the MGB, Lubyanka. Lubyanka was one of the most feared addresses in the Soviet Union. Thousands had been dragged through its doors. Many never emerged at all. Inside, Alexander was taken to a processing room and ordered to undress completely. He sat in a chair and began removing his clothes. When he looked up, the guard had his coat spread on the table, slicing open the seams with a knife, tearing into the seams and lapels, ripping out the shoulders. Then the shoes. The guard attacked the soles with his knife. They were looking for secret compartments, for hidden microfilm, for evidence of espionage. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. He was not a spy. He was a clerk. The Soviet secret police didn't care. In their logic, the confession was the evidence. Once you signed, reality adjusted to your words. They had already decided he was a spy. Their job now was to break him. They put him into a Lubyanka cell designed not just for confinement, but for psychological disintegration. The cell was so small you could neither stand comfortably nor lie down properly. The walls were dark, destroying the sense of time and distance. There was no window, no sunlight, no connection with the outside world. The lights were left on constantly, harsh and bright, burning into his eyes. Sleep became a kind of torture. Guards came at random intervals, banging on the door, jolting him awake, shouting meaningless demands, making sure he never sank into real rest. He was isolated from other prisoners, cut off from any human contact except with his interrogators.
This technique was part of what the Soviets called the conveyor belt. Multiple interrogators took shifts, ensuring that the prisoner never had a moment of mental or physical respite. The goal was to attack the mind relentlessly while leaving as few visible marks as possible. No elaborate devices were necessary. Exhaustion, fear, hunger, and uncertainty did the work. Alexander's main interrogator was a colonel named Sidorov. It was his profession to extract confessions. The interrogation began on the day of the arrest and continued for 2 days and 2 nights, almost without pause. No real food, almost no water, and absolutely no sleep. Over and over, the same accusations. You are a spy. You worked for the American embassy. You gathered intelligence against the Soviet Union. You must confess. Under this assault, reality starts to blur. After 48 hours without sleep, the human brain cannot function normally. Hallucinations, confusion, and a sense that any path, even a false confession, is better than the endless grinding pressure. Alexander was a trained filing clerk, not a hardened operative. Under extreme sleep deprivation and psychological pressure, he eventually signed what they put in front of him, a confession admitting to crimes he had never committed. For the MGB, that was enough. The fiction was now fact in his file. But Lubyanka was only the first circle of this inferno. After months of interrogation there, the MGB decided that Sidorov's methods had gone as far as they could. They wanted to break Alexander even further, so they sent him to a place that even seasoned Soviet prisoners feared more than almost any other, Sukhanovka. Sukhanovka prison was a special interrogation center outside Moscow. It was not a labor camp. Nobody was sent there to serve out a sentence. It was a place for special cases, where the aim was to completely destroy resistance through a combination of physical brutality and refined psychological torture. Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who survived the Gulag system and later described it in The Gulag Archipelago, called Sukhanovka the most terrible prison that the MGB ever had. Coming from a man who had seen almost everything the camps had to offer, that judgment meant something. When Alexander arrived at Sukhanovka in 1949, he came under the authority of Mikhail Ryumin, a senior interrogator and deputy head of a special department. Ryumin wasn't just an administrator of torture, he was a direct practitioner. Colleagues later described him as half-educated, crude, violent. Stalin reportedly referred to him as a pygmy, but Ryumin's power over prisoners' lives was immense, and he used it with enthusiasm. At one point, Ryumin told Alexander, "I have a Cossack method of beating. I draw while I beat. You have never felt such pain. Never." And then he beat him into unconsciousness with a heavy rubber truncheon. Other prisoners recalled how Ryumin covered his office's Persian carpet with a sheet before starting so that blood and bodily fluids would not damage the rug. Some prisoners were carried out on stretchers after his sessions. One of them, Boris Shmelyovich, reported receiving 80 to 100 blows a day. Physical violence was only one layer. Sukhanovka specialized in isolation and sensory control. Prisoners were held in single cells, cut off entirely from human contact. Some days the cells were kept in total darkness, leaving the prisoner disoriented and unable to see his own hands. Other days, powerful lights made it impossible to escape brightness. Temperatures were manipulated, sometimes bitingly cold, sometimes oppressively hot. The interrogation schedule was relentless, up to 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. Sundays were nominally a rest day from direct questioning, but there was no extra food, no comfort, no humane treatment. At night, prisoners lay on bare, hard cots without blankets or pillows. The goal, as always, was to shatter the mind and will. Many did break. Many signed anything put before them. Many simply died. According to Solzhenitsyn, Alexander was one of the very few prisoners he personally knew who had survived interrogation at Sukhanovka at all. That alone places him in a rare category, not because he was superhuman, but because his way of resisting made a qualitative difference. After months of this, Alexander was eventually transferred again. By 1950-51, the MGB had finished processing him. They handed down a sentence, 25 years in a labor camp under Article 58 for anti-Soviet activity and espionage. No fair trial, no legal defense, only the paper trail of forced confessions. He was shipped thousands of kilometers away to Kazakhstan, to a special camp known as Zeplag, near Zhezkazgan. Zhezkazgan was a copper mining region in the middle of the Kazakh steppe. The environment itself was lethal. Summers could rise above 40 degrees Celsius, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Winters could drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The camp regime was harsher than in ordinary Gulag camps. Mail was heavily restricted or banned. Prisoners were referred to by numbers, not names. Any sense of personal identity was systematically stripped away. Most prisoners worked in the copper mines, performing punishing physical labor deep underground or in open pits, with inadequate clothing, food, or safety measures. The average life expectancy for a newcomer assigned to the mines was measured in months, not years.
Dust damaged the lungs, causing silicosis. Food was chronically inadequate. Clean water was scarce. Accidents were routine. For many, the mines were a slow-motion execution.
Daily life was mechanical and brutal. Wake up at 4 in the morning, roll call, march to the worksite. A meager breakfast, then hours of labor until late afternoon. A thin soup for lunch, and then the march back. Dinner was another small ration of bread and watery stew. The barracks were semi-dugouts, partially below ground, crowded, poorly heated, with 50 to 100 men squeezed into each structure. In winter, some prisoners simply froze to death overnight. Alexander understood that if he remained in the mines, he would not last. So he looked for a way to use his skills and intelligence to get out of the worst assignment. He managed to secure a position in the camp hospital. There, he learned the basics of nursing, dressing wounds, recognizing infections, dealing with the illnesses that swept through the camp. He read Soviet medical texts in Russian and applied what he learned. The work was still hard, but it was no longer a direct path to extermination. The hospital job, combined with his mental discipline, increased his chances of survival dramatically. But survival was never guaranteed. He still lived under constant threat. At any moment, a guard could decide to punish him. A political shift in Moscow could decide the fate of thousands of prisoners overnight. And psychologically, the weight of years in prison, torture, isolation, and now forced labor could have crushed him. The reason it did not says everything about the way he chose to fight back, with his mind. In his cell, under interrogation, and later in the camp, Alexander developed mental habits to keep from collapsing. One of these was what might be called mental geography. Deprived of any physical freedom, he created freedom in his imagination. He measured the walls of his cell, memorizing distances and steps. He carefully noted the length of the corridors he was forced to walk to the interrogation rooms. Then he converted those units into an imaginary journey. Step by step, day after day, he calculated that he had walked a distance equivalent to going from Moscow through Europe and out into the Atlantic on the way back to America. In his mind, he was walking home. He also turned to memory and imagination through movies and music. He mentally replayed films he had seen, reconstructing them shot by shot. He ran through the song and dance number Chattanooga Choo Choo in his head, hearing the music, seeing the performers, staging the choreography in perfect detail, even though in reality he was alone in a dark, filthy cell. He did it silently. To hum or sing would have invited punishment. But the inner cinema gave him something the MGB couldn't take away, a connection to human culture, to humor, to beauty, to a life beyond the walls. Then there was communication. The prison system aimed to cut each prisoner off from every other human being, but Alexander and others found a way to punch through that barrier. They used tapping on the walls, an improvised code based on Morse, but adapted to the Russian alphabet. 5 rows of 6 letters each allowed them to transmit the entire alphabet by counting taps and pauses. Night after night, he heard faint tapping from the neighboring cell. At first, he didn't understand. Then one day, it clicked. The pattern was a deliberate sequence, an alphabet. The man in the neighboring cell had been trying to talk to him for months. When Alexander understood, he felt a surge of emotion, a wave of warmth and gratitude toward a man he had never seen, who had been asking him over and over, "Who are you?" The content of the messages was basic: name, nationality, fragments of biography, but the significance was enormous. It meant he was not alone. It meant that behind the concrete and steel, there was still a community of human beings stubbornly asserting their existence. These mental strategies, mapping distances, replaying films, silently singing, tapping out code, were not just distractions, they were acts of resistance. They were ways of preserving a core identity the state could not erase.
Alexander refused to think of himself as merely a prisoner. He continued to think of himself as an American, even though he had left the United States as a child and had lived his entire adolescence and adulthood in the Soviet Union. That inner allegiance gave him a vantage point from which to judge his captors and their ideology, rather than simply absorbing their narrative. By the early 1950s, Soviet politics began to shift. In March 1953, Stalin died. His death set off a power struggle at the top of the regime and led to some reforms, however limited. Lavrentiy Beria, the feared head of the security services, was arrested and executed. Gradually, in the mid-1950s, the regime began to reassess some of the extreme abuses of Stalin's era. In 1956, after Nikita Khrushchev delivered his secret speech denouncing parts of Stalin's terror, the government announced partial amnesties. On July 13, 1956, after 7 years and 8 months of imprisonment and camp labor, Alexander was released under one of these measures. But it is critical to note he was not exonerated. The Soviet state did not admit that the charges were fabricated. He was freed administratively, not declared innocent, and his freedom came with conditions. He was not allowed to leave the Soviet Union. He was not allowed to contact the American embassy. He was, in effect, on an invisible leash. He settled in Moscow, working as a translator of medical literature. He tried to build a life under surveillance. His parents had not been untouched by the system. His father had been arrested years earlier for making an offhand remark that American cars were better than Soviet ones, sentenced under the infamous Article 58 for anti-Soviet agitation, and then released shortly before Alexander's return. He died in the Soviet Union. His mother had been arrested and tortured in an attempt to force her to denounce her own son. She was driven insane and eventually died in an asylum. Alexander learned these facts only after his release. The regime had not only attacked him, it had shattered his family.
In those post-Stalin years, Alexander came into contact with others who had survived the Gulag and were now living precariously in Moscow. Among them were Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Literature, and the Estonian writer Georg Tenno. They shared their experiences, compared notes, and provided each other with emotional and intellectual companionship. Solzhenitsyn later used Alexander's experiences under the anonymized label Alexander D in The Gulag Archipelago. The fact that Solzhenitsyn singled out Dolgun as one of the only men he knew to have survived Sukhanovka underlined the extremity of what Alexander had endured. Still, 15 years went by. Alexander remained trapped in the Soviet Union, technically free, but barred from leaving the country of his torment. The breakthrough came from outside, from his sister, Stella. Stella had escaped the Soviet Union back in 1941 and had built a new life in the United States. She eventually worked at the United Nations. For decades, she did not know whether her brother was alive or dead. Finally, in the late 1960s, through indirect channels and immense effort, she managed to establish contact. She sent a carefully worded, coded letter that reached Alexander without alerting the Soviet censors to its full significance. The message was simple but powerful. Your family knows you are alive, and we will fight for you. Stella then launched a determined campaign to secure his release. She raised his case with journalists, diplomats, and human rights advocates. She refused to let his name disappear. Over time, the case reached the highest levels of American diplomacy. Secretary of State William Rogers became personally involved. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials pressed Soviet representatives about Dolgun. It took years, but pressure accumulated. In Moscow, the American ambassador John P. Humes also took an interest.
By 1971, in the context of broader U.S.-Soviet negotiations, the Kremlin finally agreed to let Alexander leave. On December 21, 1971, he was brought to Sheremetyevo Airport for departure. A U.S. diplomat, Peter Swires, was there to meet him. Swires later recalled that although he had never seen him before, he recognized him instantly in the crowd. The reason was not a photograph, it was posture. Alexander walked with his head up, shoulders back, in a way that contrasted sharply with the slightly stooped, cautious gait of many Soviet citizens. Even after decades in the Soviet Union, he still carried himself as an American. He boarded the plane and flew out, first to Vienna and then on to the United States. After 37 years in the Soviet Union, including almost 8 years in the Gulag and 15 more as a semi-prisoner in Moscow, he was finally home. Back in America, Alexander tried to resume a normal life. He found work at the National Institutes of Health in the Fogarty International Center, dealing with Soviet-American medical cooperation. But the experiences he had lived through could not simply be filed away. In the early 1970s, he began working with writer Patrick Watson to record his story in full. The result, published in 1975, was Alexander Dolgun's Story, An American in the Gulag. The book laid out in vivid detail the mechanisms of arrest, interrogation, prison life, and forced labor. It described Lubyanka, Sukhanovka, step-lag, and the psychological techniques used to break prisoners. It gave names, dates, methods, concrete facts that could be cross-checked and incorporated into the growing body of work on Soviet repression. For Western audiences, the memoir did several things at once. It confirmed what dissidents like Solzhenitsyn and Shalamov were saying about the Gulag, but from the perspective of an American citizen. It provided material for historians, journalists, and policymakers trying to understand the full nature of Soviet power. It gave moral weight to the argument that the conflict with the Soviet Union was not just geopolitical, but civilizational, a clash between a system that treated human beings as disposable and a system that, despite its flaws, was built around individual rights and rule of law. In a more personal level, the book showcased the extraordinary resilience of one man. It showed how someone with no military training, no intelligence background, no institutional support survived conditions that had killed countless others. It showed the central role of mental discipline, creativity, and inner freedom. It embodied the idea that the human mind, when determined, can endure and outlast even highly organized systems of terror. Alexander's health, however, had been permanently damaged. Years of hunger, exposure, and physical abuse took their toll. He developed severe kidney problems and other long-term consequences of his imprisonment. In 1986, at the age of 59, he died in Maryland. His wife, Irene, who had been born in the Soviet Union and adapted well to life in America, and his son, Andrew, survived him, as did Stella, the sister whose persistence helped free him. The legacy he left is larger than one life. His testimony became part of the official historical record of the Gulag. Researchers continue to cite his experiences. His story appears in studies of Soviet repression, in discussions of psychological survival under extreme conditions, and in teaching materials about the Cold War. Solzhenitsyn's use of his experience in the Gulag archipelago further embedded Alexander's ordeal into the canon of essential texts on 20th-century totalitarianism. His story also illuminates a broader truth about the Cold War. While the Soviet state invested enormous energy into refining techniques of intimidation, interrogation, and control, it systematically crushed individual initiative, free thought, and independent creativity. That had costs, not only moral, but technological and strategic. A system that treats individuals as tools rather than as sources of ideas will, over time, fall behind a society that encourages experimentation, dissent, and innovation. While Soviet officers were perfecting sleep deprivation regimes and isolation cells, American scientists and engineers were pioneering computers, integrated circuits, advanced aircraft, space technology, and medical breakthroughs. The same period that saw men beaten unconscious on a hidden Persian carpet in Sukhanovka saw Americans laying the groundwork for sending astronauts to the moon and building the information technologies that would later make censorship and secrecy far more difficult. In that sense, the story of Alexander Dolgun is not just a story about Soviet brutality, it is also a story about the long-term superiority of a system that respects the individual mind over one that tries to dominate it. The American system is not perfect, but it does something the Soviet system could not do. It allows people to think freely, to create, to criticize, to expose wrongdoing, and, over time, to correct course. On December 13, 1948, a young American vanished into a building in Moscow. For years, his government did little, his family heard nothing, and his fate could easily have been the same as the millions of others who never came back. But he refused to surrender his identity. He refused to let his mind be colonized. He survived. His sister refused to accept his disappearance. She fought. Eventually, American diplomats used the tools of a free society, press coverage, public pressure, negotiation, to force his captors to release him. His life forms a bridge between the millions who disappeared into the Gulag with no voice and the free societies that later learned in detail what had been done in those cells and camps. His name is a reminder that the Cold War was not an abstract contest of doctrines, but a struggle over the bodies and minds of real human beings. His name was Alexander Dolgun. He was an American who endured the worst the Soviet system could inflict and lived to expose it. His story is and should remain one that every defender of freedom knows.